Now in part two, we will look at 1920s up until the 21st century and how Puerto Rico's economy continued to change due to its colonial rule. So, Julio, on one of the next big pieces of legislation by the colonial U.S. government was the Jones Act in 1920. How did this affect food on the island?
Yeah, so the Jones Act or Marine Act was basically enacted to protect the American maritime industry. It applies to every state, but it requires that all goods transported between American ports are transported by American vessels. This comes at a way higher cost than any other merchant marine fleet in the world. Basically, everything that comes into Puerto Rico is subject to this Jones Act. This translates to an additional 11.5 tax on imported foodstuff to compensate for the transportation of those goods. Now, like I mentioned in the previous video, Puerto Rico imports 85% of all the food they consume. So the added tax and cost of transportation means that everything at the supermarket is 21% higher than in the US. And we're talking about a population that the median income is under 30,000 a year, right? Below any of the states. So everything in Puerto Rico is very expensive. Even the tax evaders flocking to the archipelago in the past years complain about how expensive everything is in Puerto Rico. So, however, what's interesting is that even though imported goods are more expensive, food is more imported food is more expensive. It comes at a higher cost compared to the United States. This still didn't enable the local agriculture to flourish. Not only did Puerto Rican policy begin favoring industrialization over agriculture around this time, but due to a combination of American foodstuff being mass produced with synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, being extremely low quality, and then also being subjected to very favorable tariffs and being heavily subsidized, American imports are still cheaper at the supermarket than food grown locally by small scale farmers.
In the 1940s, part of the larger U.S. federal government spending, included Operation Bootstrap, which aimed to industrialize the island's economy from an agrarian past. So, can you tell us about the program and how it rapidly changed the island in the following decades?
Yeah, definitely. So before we get to that point, it's important to quickly note that the peak of the sugarcane industry was in the early 1930s. The 30s were a decade of extreme poverty. For example, while the sugar corporation reported $42 million in profit, the average wage of a cane worker was just under $4 a week. And then 90% of those wages they had to spend on food staples, right? Because there was hardly any local agriculture. And they were buying that food from the sugar plantations who were marking up the prices even more, right? They were also subjected to terrible working conditions at the plantations, which led to massive protest movements. Pedro Albizu Campos became a pivotal figure in these movements. And the protests were successful. No, it led to better working conditions, better pay, shorter work hours. Right? I mean, successful. And at the same time, the Puerto Rican government was trying to enacted agrarian reforms that sought to stifle the growth of these large cane sugar plantations. Started buying land from these sugar magnates and redistributing it. Basically started running state-funded sugar refineries. But I mean, what happens when the success and the profits of an industry solely dependent on exploitation seeks to enact some form of equity? Profits fall, right? So the industry, because of all these, right, like higher wages, the corporations not owning as much land, not being able to exploit their workers, profits started to fall, and the industry quickly declined after that. So industrialization, Operation Bootstrap in the 1940s was basically the Puerto Rican government's answer to this economic decline. They enacted Operation Bootstrap, and Puerto Rico's rapid industrialization after the 50s basically finished decimating agriculture in Puerto Rico, right? So you had higher paying jobs at factories, manufacturing, whatever. So people were leaving the countryside to the cities to work at these jobs. Those people that couldn't find jobs in the factories were basically had no other choice but to leave Puerto Rico and go to the United States. So that's where we saw this first wave of Puerto Rican migrants into cities in the East Coast. And yeah, and then there's also kind of like a stigma that started developing around being a farmer, right? Like if you were a farmer, you were poor, you were uneducated, which is obviously false. Uh, Something which is ironic considering that the jíbaro or peasant is the symbol of the Partido Popular Democrático. So just to kind of sum everything up, like between 1915 and 1977, over 162,000 agricultural jobs were lost. Meanwhile, only 76,000 manufacturing jobs were created. So agriculture was slowly lost. For example, according to USDA statistics, local total sales from Puerto Rico's farms have declined by 2/3 since then, since 1964. So this is an industry that with industrialization, it rapidly declined.
What are some of the other ways, not just through like Operation Bootstrap, but what are some of the other ways the U.S. government and or corporations that obviously go hand in hand with the U.S. government exploited the land instead of leaving it for the people and producing fresh food?
Yeah, there's a couple examples, right? So the Puerto Rican government, instead of investing in agriculture, they use federal funds to fund basically food assistance programs, right? In order to pay for imported stuff instead of using that money to help farmers in Puerto Rico. Another example is during World War II, something like 10% of all fertile land on Puerto Rico became military bases. And then the third example is there are large tracts of agricultural land that are dedicated to agri-science development in Puerto Rico right now. Uh, People may not know this, but Puerto Rico is one of the biggest producers of and exporters of GMO seeds in the world. Monsanto, which is arguably one of the most evil corporations in the world, owns large tracts of land where they grow these seeds as well as they develop new pesticides, fertilizers, and other agricultural chemicals, which have wreaked havoc on the environment and the local communities.
Between 1998 and 2018, the number of farms in Puerto Rico decreased by 58%. At this point, in the 2020s, like the most up-to-date research that we have now, PR imports over 85% of all of its food, despite being a great climate, an island where you can grow a lot of food, very fresh, healthy food. So how does this affect the island from both a financial perspective and, more importantly, a public health perspective?
It's interesting because although agriculture and export agriculture is it's a really smart part of the economy of Puerto Rico, which the concept of economy is another concept that needs to be discussed, right? Maybe for another video. This idea that GDP is the only determinant of a healthy nation, just another Western notion that in the process of Puerto Rico's decolonization, I think Puerto Ricans really need to challenge and move away from. But having this Western colonial mindset driving all of the decisions in Puerto Rico has greatly impacted food sovereignty and local food production. On the one hand, most of the plantains and root products like vianda, yuca, ñame, yautía, I think also melons are that are consumed in Puerto Rico are grown locally. Everything else is imported. You have a small export economy around rice. In the past, you had sugar, coffee, chocolate at one point, and some fruits. Mangoes, for example, there's a couple mango farms in the south of the island that cover thousands of acres, but 80% of those crops go to Europe. you know, 10% to the US and only 10% stays local. Now, mangoes may not be the best example because there's mango trees everywhere in the island, so people have access to mangoes everywhere. But it still doesn't address the fact that these thousands of acres that are used to grow mangoes to send to Europe. There's even one of the farms is owned by an Israeli, so all of the mangoes grown there go to Israel. You know, this is land that could be used to grow food for Puerto Ricans that will stay in the island. Um, so you have that, right, which is this colonial mentality of around food. Um, and then you have another aspect, which is that the Puerto Rican government uh, it 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 really discriminates against local farmers. Uh, the government prefers to give subsidies and tax breaks to foreigners because exporting these products makes the GDP look good. And then on the other hand, they make it impossible for local agricultural projects to get started unless they're large scale monoculture projects, primarily for export, which these are harmful to the environment. Like if I think people at this point, everyone should know that large scale agriculture is one of the biggest drivers for climate change. Monocultures are not resilient to storms, so they are very reliant on pesticides and fertilizers, which fertilizers runoff causes huge algae blooms, killing everything in the ocean. So uh, the Puerto Rican government favors these type of farms than the agroecological smaller organic projects that people want to move towards. And local farmers, they don't receive the tax breaks or subsidies that the foreigners get either. So all of these barriers make growing food locally very expensive and very difficult. You have recent cases, right, of like the egg industry that was decimated by sheep imports from the U.S. Same thing with pollo pico, right? It was replaced by chicken that was imported, and then even now you have the ongoing protest of the unionized workers of Suiza Dairy who are protesting the mismanagement of their healthcare plant. So what did Suiza Dairy do? They went ahead and closed the operations, leaving 483 employees without work. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if this whole thing with Suiza Dairy ends up in a permanent closure, only to facilitate the importation of milk from the United States. So instead of Puerto Ricans having to rely, so in pause, and then I'll pick it up. So now you're like basically importing everything. So Puerto Ricans are reliant on buying substandard, unhealthy, and heavily processed American food. We all know that the majority of American food is junk and is garbage, right? Like the food that we eat here in the States is banned in most other countries. You know, like you have American corporations that go over to Europe and they're selling the same product, but the ingredients are completely different because half of them are illegal in those countries, right? So all of this garbage and terrible food that has been dumped on Puerto Ricans that is cheap has led to extremely detrimental health issues. Uh, and also, it's affected the culture of Puerto Rico, right? Like you've been replacing our local cultural foods with fast food, burgers, pizza, hamburgers, all of this crap, right? So it just to sum it up, the Americanization of the Puerto Rican diet has led to massive rates of obesity and diabetes. And not to mention that this food, even though it's cheaper, is still coming at a higher cost because it's imported.
Julio, thank you so much for this awesome information. That concludes part 2 of our 3-part series of food sovereignty and PR. Please stay tuned for part 3. Let us know what you think in the comments, and we'll see you soon.